Okay, welcome back. In the next set of videos, or this chapter I should say, we're going to focus on using a few different rendering techniques and tools that we have available to us in Mentor using exercise 7, and we're going to combine them to finish off a little mini project here. Now the goal of this project is to make a photorealistic render. We want to stick to photorealism as much as possible. So we're going to see how we can do that using some tools and features here in exercise 7. So let's open up an example scene here, and the example scene we want to open up is called HDRI Start. Okay, so in this scene we have a pretty simple scene set up here. Let's go ahead and do a preview render and see what we have. So we have ourselves what appears to be some tiles here for a kitchen countertop or something like that, and then some Christmas decorations or Christmas balls here, of course, for the season that's upon us. And then of course we have this sort of a glass cup here or whatnot. Whatever this is supposed to be. It is supposed to be a glass cup, by the way. So we have ourselves a pretty ugly render. And the reason that is because all we have in this scene is geometry. So somebody gave us the geometry. Now it's up to us to go ahead and create a nice render. So we got to apply shaders. We're going to have to set up some lighting and things like that. We're also going to use something called HDRI, or high dynamic range imaging, to go ahead and do ourselves an image-based lighting pass using an HDR image to go ahead and create some photorealistic results here. So let's see how that works. Let me go ahead and close that right there since we won't need it. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of my default lighting. So I'm going to go ahead and go to ambience here and take the ambience off completely. If I open up an Explorer, I can see that I have a default light set up here, which is an infinite light. We won't actually be needing this light. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of it. Let's just hit delete to get rid of it completely. Now if I do a preview render, all I get is pitch black. The reason is there's no lighting in the scene, so it's like being in a dark spot in outer space, which is obviously no good. So what we want to do is set up an image-based lighting pass. So how do we do that? Well, it's pretty easy in XSI. If we come over here to the render menu under pass, we can go over here to edit, we can go to new pass, and over here we get a huge selection of different passes that we can create. Basically preset passes. We can do passes for shadows, for depth, for all kinds of stuff. The one pass that we're interested in is the image-based lighting pass. So let's go ahead and click on that. And now XSI asks us a very important question here. So it's asking us, would you like to use an existing image clip or create a new one? Okay, basically the question is, the image clip is the HDR image that we're going to use for our scene. Okay, XSI doesn't know what HDR image you're going to use for your image-based lighting pass. So we have to go ahead and tell it. If we hit yes, it's going to use an image clip that's already loaded in this scene. Since the scene is brand new, it doesn't have any image clips. So let's go ahead and hit no. When we hit no, XSI opens up a file browser here and it defaults to our project directory, as you can see up here. The image we're looking for is one that comes with the project files for this tutorial, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to be this image over here called archviz.hdr. It's a pretty small image, only 2.1 megabytes. Let's go ahead and open up that image. You'll see some PPGs pop up automatically. That's because it's setting up the pass for you. Okay, so it opens up the pass options here for you automatically. What I'm going to do is lock that down. I'm going to have to make some changes in a moment. And then it opens up a few PPGs here for the image. You'll also notice another PPG for an override, and I'll talk about that in a moment. These image clips here, let's go ahead and let's close these. Okay. And let me go ahead and explain what this property clip, or I'm sorry, property page over here on the left is all about. This is basically an override. In previous versions of XSI, what would happen is that you would have to turn final gathering on your own. So why do we need final gathering? Because HDR rendering with Mentor works best when you use final gathering. Do you have to use final gathering? No, not exactly. However, you're going to get very nice results, and probably the best results if you do use final gathering with HDR rendering. Okay, so this override opens up automatically and it enables final gathering. Let me lock that down and show you what I'm talking about. Let me go over here to render, and I'll go to renderer options. Here's my renderer options here. I'll go to final gathering. You notice final gathering is automatically turned on for this pass. By default, final gathering is actually supposed to be turned off. But because exercise 7 went ahead and created this render override for us automatically, we can control the final gathering from here. So if I turn it off from the override, it turns off in the mental ray render settings for that pass. If I turn it back on, it turns back on. So that's all that is. Let me go ahead and close that. I'll also go ahead and close the render properties there. And now let's look at the pass properties with this PPG that was one of the PPGs that opened up automatically when we applied the image-based lighting pass. Okay, so we can change these options here. I'm going to leave this default name of HDRI because it makes perfect sense for our pass to be called HDRI. But down here, I'm going to go ahead and turn on override scene render options. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose custom format, and I'm going to choose 400 pixels there by 270, just so we get faster preview renders. The smaller the render preview, the faster it renders. So let me go ahead and close this, and now let's do another render. So we'll do another render preview here, and you'll notice that it's calculating final gathering, and we have some lighting in our scene. Voila. What's basically happening is that our scene went from pitch black to being completely lit up. Why is that happening? The reason that's happening is because we're using an HDR image on our scene, on the environment of our scene, which can help to light up our scene using final gathering. This is called HDR rendering. Now let's go very quickly over here to render, and we'll go to pass options, and we're back to the same PPG that I just closed a moment ago. These are pass options. If I go over here to the pass shaders tab, you'll notice that there's a shader in the environment stack here, and it's an environment shader. So we can double click on it to open up that shader's PPG. What we have here, let me lock that down, is an environment shader set up for our entire scene based on this HDRI pass that we just created. Okay, and what we can do is we can change the environment mode from spherical to cylindrical, cubic strip, and you get the idea. You have all these different options as to how you want to project that environment using this shader, okay, using the environment shader. So let's do a little render preview. And you can see it's calculating final gather pretty fast. I'm using an 8-core machine, but because I'm so cheap, I want the renders to go even faster. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come over here to render. I'm going to go to renderer options. Under the final gathering tab, I'm going to go ahead and switch this from multi-frame to automatic, and I'm going to change the number of rays from 100 to about 32. I'm very, very cheap that way. And I'll do another render preview, and now final gather is a bit faster because it's got to do much less rays. Okay, so we can see our lighting in our scene. Perfect. Let's see what happens when we change some of these environment modes. For example, right now it's set to spherical. Let's change it to cylindrical. And you notice that the lighting changes as well as the image in the background. Basically, changing the environment mode changes the way that this HDR image, which you can see here in this environment clip right here, how it's being projected in the background, or the environment I should say, of this scene. So we can change to a cubic strip, for example. And every time you change the way that this image is being projected in your scene, it's also going to change the lighting, because the lighting is based on the HDR image. This HDR image is a 32-bit HDR image, and it has a whole lot of light information that's being used by mental ray to light up the scene with final gather. So it's a very neat way, and it's actually a very common way of lighting up scenes in the film and the visual effects industry. Okay, so there you can see the different modes here that you can use here. I'm going to stick with spherical for the intents and purposes of this tutorial. And I'm also going to show you what some of these settings down here do. For example, background. By default, it's set to 1. If we go ahead and drop that down, what it's going to do is the image will still continue to be lit up the same way. It'll still have the same amount of lighting. That doesn't change. But the background image, the HDR image that's being projected in the environment, actually gets dimmer. So you can control the brightness and intensity of the background. And if you put it completely to 0, you pretty much get rid of the image completely. So you just get this black background, and you just get the lighting in your scene without the image, just in case if that's what you want. Now reflections does exactly what it says. If you lower the amount of reflections, objects in your scene won't reflect the HDR image as much. The lighting stays exactly the same, but any reflections on shiny or mirror-like objects in your scene will be lessened if you lower this reflections value, and they'll be increased if we go ahead and increase the reflections value. So it's pretty simple to use. Then we also have this image parameter right here. And if we lower the image parameter, this time you'll notice that the image stays intact, but the lighting changes. So it can seem kind of confusing, but it makes perfect sense once you understand it. Basically, lowering the image amount lowers the amount of lighting that the HDR image is projecting into your scene. So if we increase it, we get more lighting from that HDR image in the background. If we decrease it, like you saw earlier, you end up lowering the light levels in your scene based on the HDR image. And then right here in the transformation, we can transform the scale, the rotation, and the translation of this object right here, or the image I should say. So you can scale the image up or down, you can rotate it. So say if you want to go ahead and rotate it in the y-axis, you can do that. So let me do that by 90 degrees. So I'm rotating the image in my scene by 90 degrees, and you can see it, the image change right there. It rotated around, and by rotating the image around, it actually changed the way that my lighting is being projected in the scene, because the image is basically like a giant light, okay? And it's based on different parts of the image. So different parts of the image are brighter, some parts are darker or dimmer, have less lighting. So it'll affect the scene accordingly. So let me go ahead and put that back to 0, which is the default. Okay, let me close that. Now if I click on edit, it'll open up a new PPG, and this PPG actually controls the image itself. So let's go to the adjust tab, and we can actually adjust HDR and OpenEXR images. So high dynamic range images can be edited using this property page here for the clip, for the image clip. And right now by default the gamma is set to 2.2. We can change that though. Let me go ahead and do a render preview here. And we can also change the exposure when using HDR images, which is our case. So I can lower the exposure, say to -2, and you'll notice now that our image gets darker because I lowered the exposure of the image, and you saw it update here in the clip property page over here. We can increase the exposure as well. So if we put an exposure of 2, we're going to get a very bright overblown image, as you can see, which in our case is not too good. But the option is there for you in case you need to increase or decrease or adjust your exposure any way that you need to. Another important thing is the color profile. In exercise 7 we have color management, and I spoke about that in volume 1 of this HDR rendering series, so I won't go into it anymore and waste your time. But when you're working with an HDR or OpenEXR image, basically HDR images, you want to go ahead and stick with linear color profile. If we switch to RGB here, we're going to get a different result. As you can see, the HDR image is not being interpreted correctly by a mental ray. So we want to make sure that we have the correct color profile set up for our HDR image. In this case, linear would be the way to go when using any type of HDR or OpenEXR image. Okay, so let me close that. Let me close that. So now that you understand how the HDR image is being applied at the pass level, it's time to go ahead and move on. So this video has been going for a pretty good while now. I'm going to end it now, and in the next video we'll pick up and continue here, and we're going to start to add shaders using some mental ray shaders in exercise 7 to get this scene to look better, obviously, because we're still a little bit far from our final goal of rendering out our photorealistic scene. Okay, so I'll leave you here and I'll see you in the next video.